A tournament, or tourney, was a chivalrous competition, a mock fight in Europe in the Middle Ages and Renaissance. It is one of various types of hastiludes. Terminology. Old French tournament was in use in the 12th century, from a verb tourner, ultimately Latin tournere, to turn. The same verb also gave rise to tourney. The French terms were adopted in English by 1300. The Old French verb in origin meant to joust, tilt, but it came to refer to the knightly tournament more generally, while jouster, approach, meet became the technical term for jousting specifically. By the end of the 12th century, tournament and Latinized tournamentum had become the generic term for all kinds of knightly hastiludes or martial displays. Roger of Hoveden, writing in the late 12th century, defined tournamentum as military exercises carried out, not in the knight spirit of hostility, but solely for practice and the display of prowess. The application of the term tournament to competition in games of skill or sports in general dates to the mid-18th century. Origins. Medieval equestrian warfare and equestrian practice did hark back to Roman antiquity, just as the notion of chivalry harked back to the rank of equites in Roman times. There may be an element of continuity connecting the medieval tournament to the hippica gymnasia of the Roman cavalry, but due to the sparsity of written records during the 5th to 8th centuries, this is difficult to establish. It is known that such cavalry games were central to military training in the Carolingian Empire, with records of Louis and Charles's military games at Worms in 843. At this event, recorded by Nithard, the initial chasing and fleeing was followed by a general melee of all combatants. Documentation of equestrian practice during the 9th to 10th centuries is still sparse, but it is clear that the tournament, properly so called, is a development of the High Middle Ages. This is recognized by medieval sources. A chronicler of Tours in the late 12th century attributes the invention of the knightly tournament to an Angevin baron, Geoffroy de Priuli, who supposedly died in 1066. In 16th-century German historiography, the setting down of the first tournament laws is attributed to Henry the Fowler. This tradition is cited by Georg Ruxner in his Thurnia-Buch of c. 1530, as well as by Paulus Hector Mayer in his De Arte Athletica. The earliest known use of the word tournament comes from the peace legislation by Count Baldwin III of Hainaut from the town of Valenciennes, dated to 1114. It refers to the keepers of the peace in the town leaving it for the purpose of frequenting javelin sports, tournaments and such like. A pattern of regular tournament meetings across northern France is evident in sources for the life of Charles, Count of Flanders. The sources of the 1160s and 1170s portray the event in the developed form it maintained into the 14th century. The tournament during the High Middle Ages. Tournaments centered on the melee, a general fight where the knights were divided into two sides and came together in a charge. Jousting, a single combat of two knights riding at each other, was a component of the tournament, but was never its main feature. The standard form of a tournament is evident in sources as early as the 1160s and 1170s, notably the Life of William Marshall and the romances of Chrétien de Troyes. Tournaments might be held at all times of the year except the penitential season of Lent. The general custom was to hold them on Mondays and Tuesdays, though any day but Friday and Sunday might be used. The site of the tournament was customarily announced a fortnight before it was to be held. The most famous tournament fields were in northeastern France, which attracted hundreds of foreign knights from all over Europe for the long séjour. Knights arrived individually or in companies to stay at one or other of the two settlements designated as the lodgings. The tournament began on a field outside the principal settlement, where stands were erected for spectators. On the day of the tournament, one side was formed of those within the principal settlement, and another of those outside. Parties hosted by the principal magnates present were held in both settlements, and preliminary jousts offered knights an individual showcase for their talents. On the day of the event, the tournament was opened by a review in which both sides paraded and called out the war cries. Then followed a further opportunity for individual jousting carried out between the ranks, the two line of knights. The opportunity for jousting at this point was customarily offered to the new, young knights present. At some time in mid-morning the knights would line up for the charge. Out of signal, a bugle, a herald's cry, the lines would ride at each other and meet with levelled lances. Those remaining on horseback would turn quickly and single out knights to attack. There is evidence that squires were present at the lists to offer the masters up to 3 replacement lances. The melee would tend then to degenerate into running battles between parties of knights seeking to take ransoms, and would spread over several square miles between the two settlements which defined the tournament area. Most tournaments continued till both sides were exhausted, or till the light faded. A few ended earlier if one side broke in the charge, panicked and ran for its home base, looking to get behind its lists and the shelter of the armed infantry which protected them. Following the tournament, the patron of the day would offer lavish banquets and entertainments. Prizes were offered to the best knight on either side, and awarded during the meals. Melee is a modern term for a type of mock combat in medieval tournaments. The melee was the mass tournament where two teams of horsemen clashed in formation. The aim was to smash into the enemy in massed formation, with the aim of throwing them back or breaking the ranks. Following a successful maneuver of this kind, the rank would attempt to turn around without breaking formation. This action was so central that it would become eponymous of the entire tradition of the tourney, a tournament by the mid-12th century. The Middle High German term for this type of contest was Buffert. Some sources may also make a distinction between melee, a mass tournament, and Buffert, as the latter could refer to a wider class of equestrian games not necessarily confined to the formal tournament reserved to nobility. Some sources distinguish between the Buffert as more playful and the tourney as, while still nominally, mock combat much closer to military reality, often leading to fatalities. The Old French mesli, brawl, confused fight, mixture, blend, is the feminine past participle of the verb mesler, to mix. The modern French form mêlée was borrowed into English in the 17th century and is not the historical term used for tournament mock battles. The term buffetin may be related to heurter, to push, collide with, or alternatively from a Frankish beherden, to fence, encompass with a fence paling. Tournaments often contained a mêlée consisting of knights fighting one another on foot or mounted, either divided into two sides or fighting as a free-for-all. The object was to capture opposing knights so that they could be ransomed, and this could be a very profitable business for such skilled knights as William Marshall. There was a tournament ground covering several square miles in northern France, to which knights came from all over Europe to prove themselves in quite real combat. The mêlée buffet was the main form of the tournament in its early phase during the 12th and 13th centuries. The joust, while in existence since at least the 12th century as part of tournaments, did not play the central role it would acquire later. Popularity. There is no doubting the massive popularity of the tournament as early as the sources permit us to glimpse it. The first English mention of tourneying is in a charter of Osborne Nisbet of Arden, a Warwickshire knight of English descent, which reveals that he travelled to Northampton and London but also crossed the Channel to join in events in France. The charter dates to the late 1120s. The great tournaments of northern France attracted many hundreds of knights from Germany, England, Scotland, Occitania and Iberia. There is evidence that 3,000 knights attended the tournament at Lagny-sur-Marne in November 1179, promoted by Louis VII of France in honor of his son's coronation. The state tournaments at Senlis and Compiègne held by Philip III of France in 1279 can be calculated to have been even larger events. Aristocratic enthusiasm for the tournament meant that it had travelled outside its northern French heartland before the 1120s. The first evidence for it in England and the Rhineland is found in the 1120s. References in the Martial biography indicate that in the 1160s tournaments were being held in central France and Great Britain. The contemporary works of Bertrand de Born talk of a tourneying world which also embraced northern Iberia, Scotland and the Empire. The Chronicle of Lauterberg indicates that by 1175 the enthusiasm had reached the borders of Poland. Despite this huge interest and wide distribution, royal and ecclesiastical authority was deployed to prohibit the event. In 1130 Pope Innocent II at a church council at Clermont denounced the tournament and forbade Christian burial for those killed in them. The usual ecclesiastical justification for prohibiting them was that it distracted the aristocracy from more acceptable warfare in defense of Christianity. However, the reason for the ban imposed on them in England by Henry II had to have lain in its persistent threat to public order. Knights going to tournaments were accused of theft and violence against the unarmed. Henry II was keen to re-establish public order in England after the disruption of the reign of King Stephen. He did not prohibit tournaments in his continental domains, and indeed 3 of his sons were avid pursuers of the sport. Tournaments were allowed in England once again after 1192, when Richard I identified 6 sites where they would be permitted and gave a scale of fees by which patrons could pay for a license. But both King John and his son, Henry III, introduced fitful and capricious prohibitions which much annoyed the aristocracy and eroded the popularity of the events. In France, Louis IX prohibited tourneying within his domains in 1260, and his successors for the most part maintained the ban. Jousting. As has been said, jousting formed part of the tournament event from as early a time as it can be observed. It was an evening prelude to the big day, and was also a preliminary to the charge on the day itself. In the 12th century, jousting was occasionally banned in tournaments. The reasons given are that it distracted knights from the main event and allowed a form of cheating. Count Philip of Flanders made a practice in the 1160s of turning up armed with his retinue to the preliminary jousts, and then declining to join the melee until the knights were exhausted and ransoms could be swept up. But jousting had its own devoted constituency by the early 13th century, and in the 1220s it began to have its own exclusive events outside the tournament. The biographer of William Marshall observed c. 1224 that in his day noblemen were more interested in jousting than tourneying. In 1223 we have the first mention of an exclusively jousting event, the Round Table held in Cyprus by John de Bolin, Lord of Beirut. Round tables were a 13th century enthusiasm and can be reconstructed to have been an elimination jousting event. They were held for knights and squires alike. Other forms of jousting also arose during the century, and by the 14th century the joust was poised to take over the vacancy in aristocratic amusement caused by the decline of the tournament equipment. It is a vexed issue as to what extent specialized arms and armor were used in melee tournaments. A further question that might be raised is to what extent the military equipment of knights and the horses in the 12th and 13th centuries was devised to meet the perils and demands of tournaments, rather than warfare. It is however clear from the sources that the weapons used in tournaments were initially the same as those used in war. It is not by any means certain that swords were blunted for most of the history of the tournament. This must have changed by the mid-13th century, at least in jousting encounters. There is a passing reference to a special spear for use in jousting in the prose Lancelot. In the 1252 jousting at Walden, the lances used had sockets, curved ring-like punches instead of points. The Statute of Arms of Edward I of England of 1292 says that blunted knives and swords should be used in tournaments, which rather hints that the use had not been general until then. Tournaments during the late Middle Ages. The tournament had a resurgence of popularity in England in the reign of the martial and crusading King Edward I and under his grandson, Edward III, yet nonetheless the tournament died out in the latter's reign. Edward III encouraged the move towards pageantry and a predominance of jousting in his sponsored events. In the last true tournament held in England in 1342 at Dunstable, the mêlée was postponed so long by jousting that the sun was sinking by the time the lines charged. The tournament survived little longer in France or Burgundy. The last known to be held was at Bruges in 1379. The same year the citizens of Ghent rioted when the Count of Flanders announced a tournament to be held at the city. The cause of the discontent was the associated expense for them. By using costumes, drama and symbolism, tournaments became a form of art, which raised the expenses for these events considerably. They had political purposes, to impress the populace and guests with their opulence, as well as the courage of the participants. Loyalty to a lord or lady was expressed through clothes and increasingly elaborate enactments. Tournaments also served cultural purposes. As the ideals of courtly love became more influential, women played a more important role in the events. They were often held in honor of a lady and they participated in the play acting and symbolism. Edward III of England regularly held tournaments, during which people often dressed up, sometimes as the Knights of the Round Table. In 1331 the participants of one tournament were all wearing green cloaks decorated with golden arrows. In the same year one was held at Cheapside, in which the king and other participants dressed as Tartars and led the ladies, who were in the colours of St. George, in a procession at the start of the event. His grandson, Richard II, would first distribute his livery badges with the White Hart at a tournament at Smithfield. Mythology and storytelling were popular aspects of tournaments. An example of this is the tournament in 1468 that was organized by Charles the Bold to celebrate his marriage with Margaret of York. The tournament was supposedly at the bidding of the Lady of the Hidden Isle. A golden tree had been erected with all the coats of arms of the participating knights. They were dressed like famous figures from legend and history, while the squires were dressed as harlequins. A notable example of an elaborate costume was Antony of Luxembourg's. Chained in a black castle, he entered the lists. He could only be freed with a golden key and approval of the attending ladies. In Florence, the military aspect of the tournaments were secondary to the display of wealth. For a tournament honoring his marriage to Clarice Orsini, Lorenzo de' Medici had his standard designed by Leonardo da Vinci and Andrea del Verrocchio. He also wore a large amount of jewelry, including the famous famous Medici diamond, Il Libro. Royalty also held tournaments to stress the importance of certain events and the nobility's loyalty. Henry VII of England and Elizabeth of York presided over a series of tournaments when the son Henry was created Duke of York. These tournaments were noted for their display of wealth. On the first day, the participants showed their loyalty by wearing the king's colours on the bodies and the queen's colours on the helmets. They further honoured the royal family by wearing the colours of the king's mother, Margaret Beaufort, on the next day. In 1511, at the court of Henry VIII of England, a tournament was held in honour of Catherine of Aragon. Charles Brandon came out of a tower which was moved onto the battlefield dressed like a pilgrim. He only took off his pilgrim's clothes after the Queen had given him permission to participate. The decline of the true tournament was not a straightforward process, although the word continued to be used for jousts until the 16th century, forced by the prominent place that tourneying occupied in popular Arthurian romance literature. Bibliography. J.R.V. Barker, The Tournament in England, 1-100-1400, ISBN 0-85115-942-7. R. Barber and J. R. V. Barker, Tournaments, Jousts, Chivalry and Pageants in the Middle Ages. J. Bumker, Ho Fischer Culture, Literature und Gesellschaft im Hohen Mittelalter. English translation by Thomas Dunlap. Courtly Culture, Literature and Society in the High Middle Ages. New York, Overlook Duckworth, 2000. ISBN 0-7156-3273-6. Section 4.3. Tournaments. L. Carolus Barré, Les Grands Tournois de Compiègne de Senlis en l'honneur de Charles, Prince de Salerne, pour l'étang de la Société Nationale des Antiquaires de France. Crouch, D. Tournament, London. Mortimer, Ian, The Perfect King, The Life of Edward III, Father of the English Nation. Vintage, pp. 88-89. Est. Mühlberger, Jousts and Tournaments, Charney and Chivalric Sport in the 14th Century. Deeds of Arms, A Formal Combats in the Late 14th Century, Highland Village, TX. The Chivalry Bookshelf. Est. Rompes les Lances. Chevaliers et Tournois au Moyen Age, Paris, Editions Autumn 2010. E. van den Nest, Tournoi d'Utes, par d'armes dans les villes de Flandre à la fin du Moyen Age, 1300 to 1486. M. Paris, La Tournoi en France, des origines à la fin du siècle, in Das Ritterliche Turnier in Mittelalter, Beatrage zu einer vergleichenden Formentend Verhaltensgeschichte des Rittertum ed. J. Fleckenstein. J. Vale, Edward III and Chivalry. Chivalric Society and its Context, 1270 to 1350.